if you enjoy what we're doing here at Spectator TV, why not take out a subscription to the Spectator magazine itself? It's the fastest growing current affairs publication in Europe. And within its pages and on our website, you can read all your favorite Spectator TV contributors. We'll even throw in a bottle of free Spectator gin if you sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer. Or you can just Google Spectator gin. That's a subscription of 12 issues for just £12, plus a free bottle of gin worth £30. Simple arithmetic will tell you that's a no-brainer. And as ever, a very special thanks to Charles Stanley for their continued support of the Week in 60 Minutes. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms, one of the oldest companies on the London Stock Exchange. We're delighted to be partners with them. Now, COVID. June the 21st is earmarked as Freedom Day on the roadmap out of lockdown. Even nightclubs are to reopen. Legal requirements on social distancing should go. And thanks to the UK's successful vaccine rollout, more than a semblance of pre-COVID normality beckons. Or does it? Is the government changing the goalposts already? Is June the 21st still our Freedom Day? And are serious hurdles to the continued rollout of the Oxford AstraZeneca jab emerging, which could spook government ministers further? Kate Andrews is our economics correspondent, editor of our daily lunchtime briefing. It's the only roundup email you'll need for the latest COVID news. You can sign on via our website as she pens this week's cover pieces headlined Roadmap to Nowhere. Kate joins us now. Kate, what's happened? This June the 21st day is not as bankable for end of lockdown anymore, is it?
Sadly, no longer. When the Prime Minister laid out his roadmap, it very much seemed like the 21st of June was Freedom Day, the day that you'd be able to go back to a nightclub, go to a mass event, not have any cap on the numbers of people who could gather together. But in truth, they left the really difficult decisions for separate reviews around social distancing, international travel, returning to work, and potentially bringing in vaccine passports. And we got the teaser this week of their initial thinking in some of these areas. And the suggestion was, we don't know when social distancing may lift. Despite telling us for months that vaccine passports were off the table, Michael Gove said that he didn't know anybody in government, including himself, that was thinking about vaccine passports a few months ago. Now he's the one leading the charge to bring them in. It very much looks like they're on the cards. If we don't have normal social distancing by the time we hit the summer, if we're having to use biosecurity cards to access events, to access the pub, they haven't ruled hospitality out, by the way. I think a lot of people will say, well, that's not the normal that we thought we were promised. That is not the full return of our freedoms. It would seem that liberty is becoming conditional on doing very specific things that the government is asking you to do. And there was always a concern that when we signed them away to tackle the pandemic, to go into lockdown to save lives, that they wouldn't come rushing back. And despite the roadmap going ahead, and I'm sure many people are looking forward to being able to get a haircut or have a pint on the 12th of April, a lot of these major questions about how free we'll actually be are outstanding.
But it's interesting that this is happening in government when the rollout of the vaccine has gone better than they could ever have hoped back in January or even in February. And I see in your article, you say that both COVID cases and deaths are down 95% since the most recent peak, down 95%. And that's an even faster decline than in Israel, which has done even more vaccination than we have. Pretty much the whole population has now been covered there. And yet there is this almost stepping back from the original roadmap. And in your article, you say it's all because they've taken fright of the possibility of a mutant strain of the vaccine, of the virus, which the vaccine won't handle. Is that really what's at the bottom of this?
Fear of a new variant is very much on people's minds in Whitehall. Ministers are concerned and the Travel Task Force is concerned. And we got their first update earlier this week about how we might resume international travel when it's legal again. It looks like we're going back to the traffic light system, where the countries that you can visit this summer and for the foreseeable future without having to quarantine when you get back either at home or in a hotel, will be countries depending on vaccination status, infection rates, and also whether or not officials think they are vulnerable to a new variant. Now, the idea of something new coming in and wiping out our vaccine progress is obviously terrifying. The difficulty in crafting public policy is that it's based on a hypothetical. So far, thankfully, we have not seen a variant that can undermine our vaccines, especially in those crucial areas of preventing hospitalization and death. So almost by nature, these rules and regulations are going to be indefinite because you're planning for something that might happen in the future, not necessarily based on the facts as they are now. So when we can travel again, it's certainly not going to be normal, and I don't think it's going to be for quite some time.
It's interesting that from the Prime Minister down, the emphasis from government is almost undermining their own strategy. The vaccine is not 100% effective. But as you point out, no vaccine is really 100% effective. And when it comes to deaths and even serious illness, this vaccine pretty much is 100% effective. Do they really know what they're doing?
So I think this is one of the most concerning areas, is that what we're told constantly seems to change. Matt Hancock told the Spectator magazine in January that he would be crying freedom once the most vulnerable were vaccinated. Grant Shapps said he would be on the barricades to restore our freedoms around a similar timeline. That hasn't happened. The Prime Minister said that we would be open by Easter because of the jab success at the end of last year. That hasn't happened. But now something even more worrying is happening. It's not just that they're pushing back this timeline. We're told actually vaccines aren't the full answer. And I do think that Boris Johnson and his officials sometimes come dangerously close to talking down these vaccines. As you say, Andrew, the fact that they're not 100% effective is really not the point. Nobody in their wildest dreams thought we would get a jab that had 100% efficacy. That Pfizer is thought to be around 94–95% effective, that AstraZeneca is very good, and that they're preventing against severe hospitalization and death is a huge success. It's a miracle, frankly, that we have multiple jabs that are as good as they are. And so if that isn't going to be what restores liberty, and now they're talking about the return of Operation Moonshot, which was estimated last year to be a £100 billion project. We're going to be doing mass testing on top of the vaccines, but perhaps even that isn't enough. We're going to have vaccine passports potentially. When does it end? And when can the public really see life being not just back to normal, but their decisions, their choices, their lifestyles being their own again, as opposed to what the state is saying they're allowed to do? It's this shift in power that liberty is now somehow conditional. And I think that's what the cover piece is trying to look at this week. Just how far down this rabbit hole do we want to go before we say enough is enough? And government needs to be transparent about criteria and deadlines and what they're actually trying to achieve.
You point out in the article how Michael Gove ruled out vaccine passports in December, that Matt Hancock, he came out against them in January, and that Mr. Zahawi, the vaccine minister, said there were no plans to do so. Where are we now with vaccine passports?
So these COVID certificates, as the Prime Minister likes to refer to them, but they're vaccine passports or bioidentity cards, are very much being considered. The official report that we got this week on the status of the review means that they are being considered for a whole host of areas, not just around mass events, but potentially to be in hospitality as well. We don't know the details about how they would work yet, although we do know that you wouldn't necessarily have to have your vaccine to have one. You could potentially have a negative COVID test or a test proving that you had COVID at some point within a certain matter of months to suggest that you also have antibodies. The idea here is that it wouldn't be fair to roll it out if some people had had the jab and others hadn't been offered it yet, especially because those people are young people at the moment. It's the under 50s who haven't been offered the jab. They are much less likely to die of this virus or get severely ill, and so there would be an imbalance there. But I think many will be asking, is it fair at all? Number one, to have promised that this wasn't a consideration, and now to be very actively looking at how they might bring it in. And number two, it seems like a very short-term tactic to hand away that kind of liberty and personal data, especially when they're saying that vaccine passports wouldn't come online until the summer at least. They're not coming online for the 12th of April or on the 17th of May when indoor hospitality reopens and hopefully we can see more people inside. they're suggesting they'll come online when we're supposedly free. And I think the idea of flashing your vaccine passport to a private pub landlord or whoever to get into an establishment, there is even talk of face scanning in order to access things that we're told we're free to do, won't quite add up to people.
There's now talk of, when vaccine passports were first discussed, it was that you would have to have some documentation to show that you had been vaccinated, probably had both jabs. But now I see government talking, you've touched on it, of biosecurity cards, which seem to be a lot more than just a bit of paper or an app that says you've been vaccinated. Is the government seriously thinking of complicating things by going down this line?
So the Prime Minister was loath to call them anything but COVID status certification at the press conference on Monday. He didn't want to call them vaccine passports, certainly not biosecurity cards. And surely the reason is, or one of the reasons we can suspect, is because the Prime Minister spent his career adamantly opposed to such things. He once said that if he were asked to produce an identity card, he would rip it up and eat it in front of the state official that asked him to do so. If you get this week's copy of The Spectator, we have assembled quite a few quotes from the Prime Minister opposed to ID cards. So I imagine it's very difficult for him to be the person who now might be ushering them into society. But we can't feel too bad for him because at the end of the day, he is the person in charge and he's the one who makes the calls. Now, maybe he's changed his mind. Maybe he thinks that they would be useful now. If so, it is not being communicated to the public. It is not at all transparent what data or ideas are backing up this idea. Because as you've mentioned throughout our chat here, Andrew, all of the data is pointing in a really positive direction. The percentage of people who have antibodies across the UK is now estimated to be over 50%, and it's just climbing because of our huge vaccine success. I think a lot of this can undermine trust if you're not honest with people about your real intentions. That NHS app that we were asked to download last year and sold on the premise that we would help track and trace people who had the virus in their contacts, but that information would be completely private, only you and you alone would see it. That app is now being talked about as this new mechanism for vaccine passports. Not only is the data not private, you're sharing it, but you're also with the venues and establishments you want to go into, but you're now uploading quite private health data into it. You know, that is a far cry from where we were just months ago. Now, I know a lot of people out there won't have my reservations. They'll be completely on board with something like this because they think it will be a good mechanism to help us get our freedoms back. But we need to have this very robust debate. At the moment, these decisions are being made by committee in reviews. This is, I think, a fundamental principle that could change the way we operate for months and potentially years to come. And we might start to see that debate. The Labour Party is, for the first time in this pandemic, really starting to push back, it seems, on this point alone. But, you know, we need to have this discussion. They may approve them in the end, they may not, but we need to be told exactly what their purpose is and why they think now, at this point of the pandemic, they're necessary, and then we can approve or criticize.
Let me bring in Jamie Njoku-Goodwin. He's the Chief Executive of UK Music. It's an umbrella organisation representing the British music industry. Jamie, welcome to Spectator TV. What is your attitude towards vaccine passports? Would that help you reopen your businesses?
So for the past year, since March last year, it's been prohibited by law to have mass events at capacity. That's had a huge impact on our industry, and the challenge for us for the past 6 months or so has been we can either put our heads under the sand and wait for this whole thing to go away, or we can look at different means and mechanisms by which we can be having events again viably and safely. So that's been looking at things like ventilation, better working guidance, testing, but also looking at things like certification. I think it's really important that we actually clarify what we're talking about here, because there's been a lot of cross purposes about this debate. Is this a vaccine passport to just prove that you've had a vaccine and are protected? Or is it about certifying and certification to show that you are at less risk of transmission? I'm really compelled by the argument for COVID status certification, not actually because of the fact it shows who's been protected, but because the increasing evidence that vaccines can reduce transmission. And then in conjunction with a test, you can be using it to show that spaces are safer for social contact. We've had a year of lockdowns, which are basically a blunt and crude object to stop social contact taking place in spaces, because government hasn't been able to identify who are the people who are at risk of transmission of this virus and who are the people that aren't. actually some sort of system where you can identify who is infectious, who might be passing this virus and who won't be, and therefore ensuring that rather than lockdowns, which mean a reduction of liberties for 60 million people, you can be restricting those restrictions to the people who are actually infectious. Seems to me to be good from a public health point of view, sensible for the large events and settings like nightclubs, music venues and mass events, which haven't been able to operate for the last year, but also importantly would hopefully reduce the possibility that you get hit with a future wave in the future and have to lock down again at some point in the future.
Kate, what do you say to that?
Well, I think if we lived in a world where none of the vaccines had been successful, and the only way to get back to some kind of normality were through, say, mass testing, the idea of a COVID passport, not a vaccine passport in that circumstance, but some kind of passport to show your COVID status, as Jamie says, might be a pragmatic one. I think there's still many ethical issues with it. I'm not sure I would be able to support it, but I think the argument would be stronger. What's strange to me is that thankfully we don't live in that world. We live in a world where we have successful vaccines. The UK is still in the top 5 countries for rate of vaccination, and it's the country where the most number of adults want to take the vaccine. There really should be no reason, because these vaccines work, by the time we get to the summer that we would be looking at bringing in something like a vaccine passport when the data is on our side and when the vaccines are on our side. And I worry about a short-termist look at freedom. Well, if we have this vaccine passport, we can get back to normal. And what we might be sacrificing in terms of the long term. Once this framework comes in, this apparatus comes in, what will government use it for? They already haven't been honest about their plans to bring it in the first place. And we don't know who will be in power in 5-10 years' time. We don't know what the circumstances will be. If we create this now, under these emergency scenarios, even though we're really moving in the right direction, I fear what it means for future freedom, not just freedom this summer.
Yeah, so actually I view this as a long-term strategy rather than just a kind of short-termist one. This shouldn't be seen as something that's going to be brought in for good or permanently, but having this as a mechanism which can either be turned on or off depending on where you are in a pandemic state seems to me to be completely sensible. There does seem to be I completely agree with Kate that if we have a vaccine that is going to work permanently, isn't going to be affected by a new variant, then this wouldn't be necessary and we could just open up. But the worry seems to be, as with all other viruses, increased transmission increases the likelihood of a mutation, and you find yourself with a virus and a variant that is going to be virus resistant. This is what happens with flu. It's why every year you have to update your flu vaccines and develop new flu vaccines. And when you've got a virus that is as transmissible as COVID, increased transmission makes that much more likely. So I see this as a means and mechanism of trying to reduce transmission in a way that isn't, again, not doing it through lockdowns, not doing it through increased and sometimes quite draconian restrictions, but by doing it in a way where you can have normal life happening, but with certain mitigations, whether that's things like mask wearing, whether that's things like COVID certification. But I think it's also really important, not just for now, but for future pandemics. We're living in an age where, if you look at loss of biodiversity, increased international travel, what's happened with climate change, it's not going to be 100 years before we're hit by the next one of these things. It could be much sooner than we think. And a strategy in the future of we're just going to lock down for a year, wait for a vaccine and then open up, personally isn't good for industries, it's not good for individuals, and it's not good for anyone. If you can have some sort of system in place for the future, that means when you are hit by a future pandemic, you can have a testing system you can stand up. You can have a certification system that says rather than having to lock down your country for a year, you can identify who is infectious, who isn't, and probably try and have a much more normal life. I think if you had this sort of certification system this time last year, with a testing capacity and a certification system by which you could identify who was going to be at risk of spreading this virus, you'd have probably been able to go a long way without locking down bars, without locking down hospitality, without stopping mass events, and actually be able to be doing life as normal. So I view certification not just as something that's important for getting out of this pandemic, but also protecting and guarding against having to lock down in future ones as well. So
Kate, what Jamie's arguing there is that a version of a biosecurity card, which is what this would almost certainly develop into, it would be a necessary tool for dealing with future pandemics. And if we have it, we might avoid the kind of lockdowns that we've had to endure in this pandemic.
Well, I'm not just sure he's arguing for a biosecurity card, but a biosecurity state. I mean, the world that Jamie just painted is one in which liberty is never fully restored. It turns out that our lifestyle before was too carefree, too loose, that we are always going to need to think about the next hypothetical thing that can go wrong. And we need to make sure that people are ready to get in line to do whatever the government asks them to do in order to tackle that hypothetical. If you have this certification system, as Jamie says, and something else comes along, whatever it may be, what's going to be the new certification? What is it this time that the state's going to ask you to do so that you can go to the pub, so that you can go to a mass event, so that you can be free? We don't know what that future is imagined to be, but let's hope that when it comes, we will have proper scrutiny and debate, and that people will have some say and get to decide what they think the right level of risk is. If we set up a system in which our freedoms are always conditional on what the state has decided is the appropriate level of risk, we are never going back to the way it was. Now, I think you can make that argument. In fact, this is exactly the debate that I think needs to happen over the next few weeks and months. Do we want to trade away all of that liberty for security? And, you know, plenty of people will, and I think that there's an argument to make, but let's be very honest about what that future actually looks like, and let's not call it normal. Let's not even call it the new normal. It would be the introduction of a biosecurity state in which it wouldn't matter if the evidence was on the government's side. It would only have to be a hypothetical. It used to be the case that if politicians wanted to infringe on your freedom, they had to present that argument, they had to make the case, and they had to convince hearts and minds. But now we're saying that that power is flipped. We'll only return it when you can prove that it's safe enough to return it, that you can prove that things won't go wrong. And I think that is the wrong place to put the power. I think that we need to flip that back because otherwise, as said, we don't know what the future looks like in 10 years' time. We don't know who's in charge. We don't know how they'll want to use this. So to bring it in these circumstances, I think could in the future go badly wrong.
Jamie, final word to you. I think a lot of people may conclude that what you're arguing for is really ID cards by the back door, but actually a lot more intrusive than ID cards because they'll contain a lot more information than Tony Blair, when he was arguing for ID cards, ever envisaged. It would be ID cards on steroids.
So, I mean, I'd firstly say I completely agree with Kate. This is a debate that actually needs to be had, a discussion that needs to be had quite openly. There's a lot of ethical and legal and regulatory issues that people need to be talking about and having an actual debate on. Look, for the past year, maybe I like the pub too much, maybe I like bars too much, but I haven't been sat there thinking, that stuff is closed, but at least I don't have to show my COVID certification status. We're living in a pandemic where difficult decisions are having to be taken, but the focus is having to be, what can you be doing to be able to make sure things are safe and not at risk of increased variants and of future waves. I don't see this as a biosecurity state. We're currently living through a world where the government is doing 1.5 million tests a day. Now, making sure you can be using that testing, those testing results, and using that testing capacity in a way that can identify how people can be kept as safe as possible. Again, I don't see that as a biosecurity state. All this sort of stuff is already happening. It's making sure that the work that's being done is being utilised as effectively as possible to prevent the threat of future waves, but also to return some of the liberties I think lots of us have missed over the past year. But I completely agree with Kate. It's a debate that I think we should be having, and that I think Kate puts her argument forward very, very well.
Well, it's a debate we've had here in Spectator TV, and we'll come back to it. Jamie Njoku-Goodwin, Chief Executive of UK Music, thanks for being with us today, and Kate Andrews of The Spectator, thank you as well.